I happened to be in London last November 11th and was struck by how much more prominent the 100-year anniversary of the end of World War I was there than it was in the United States. So I began searching to see who we could get to come and speak to us about the Great War. And I was fortunate to discover that we are going to be joined by Michael Geyer. Michael's the Samuel N. Harper Professor Emeritus in History at the University of Chicago. He has taught and published extensively on 20th century German military history, as well as the history of the first two world wars. He was a founding member and faculty director of the Human Rights Program, which is now the Posen Family Center on Human Rights at the University of Chicago. His current research focuses on two seemingly disparate themes, but you'll see how they come together. He's writing a global history of the two world wars, which embeds the extreme violence and the pursuit of racial homogeneity and Lebensraum in the context of worldwide struggle for sovereignty and autonomy in an imperial world. Concurrently, he's also working on a collective biography of the two generations of a German-Jewish Czech family, in part as a memorial obligation and in part as an intimate experienced history of German life in the 20th century. Recent work on World War I also includes essays on the massacre at Taganrog in Russia and military socialization of wars for mass destruction. Michael's a German native and American citizen who completed his DPhil at Albert Ludwigs University in Freiburg in 1976. He then moved to St. Anthony's College, Oxford, as a junior fellow before going to the University of Michigan and ultimately landing at the University of Chicago in 1987, where he retired 3 years ago. Among many, many awards, he had a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Humboldt Research Prize, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So please join me in welcoming Michael. He'll speak for 40 minutes. We'll have a short, brief interlude, and then we'll do question and answers after that.
Well, thank you, Anil, for this very kind introduction, and thank you for joining me. I came from Hyde Park, where it isn't snowing much, but here you do have quite a bit of snow. So thank you for joining me for this occasion. This is February 2019, as you well know. We are some 4.5 years beyond the 100-year mark of the outbreak of World War I, which began on July 28, 1914, with Austria-Hungary declaring war against Serbia and bombarding Belgrade. This initial act set in motion a cascade of such declarations of war, which by mid-August engulfed not only all of Europe, but by August 23 also Japan. Within barely 3 weeks, a war in the Balkans had become a world war and indeed a global war. This kind of rapid expansion, this explosive expansion, I think you would want to keep in mind as a first thing. We just passed the centenary mark of the end of World War I, November 11, 1918, or in any case, what history curricula typically considered to be the end and what is celebrated and what was celebrated in London, Paris, and in Berlin as the end of World War I. This refers to the armistice on the Western Front, which is the front that cut right through northern Belgium and northern France down to the Swiss border. An armistice that was signed at 6 a.m. in Compiègne, France, and commenced at 11 a.m., bringing a war of unimaginable violence to an end. Try to imagine, and I hope, well, it's an imagination anyways, an act of imagination. Try to imagine 9.7 million military deaths, between 1914 and 1918, and let historians debate minor variances in the accuracy of these numbers. We are clearly at about 9 to 10 million soldiers, men dying, most of them, contrary to previous wars, in battle. This is the scene of Henry II, except that this scene is extraordinarily magnified beyond any imagination. Even if I were to get the statistical average down to 6,600 men who died daily, every day, from August 1914 to November 1918, you would be hard-pressed to imagine this. Statistically, and this comes from a very neat statistic in The Economist, this gives you an impression of what an extraordinary event this was. Because in addition to the war deaths, which is the lowest column in each case, you have to add the injured and the incapacitated. And then you have to add all the soldiers that also fought and somehow made it. Very few of them made it through unscathed. If in this war you were entering the war, you knew that at the end of it, you'd either be dead or you'd have some lifelong injury to deal with. However, this is just the starting point of this extraordinary event which escapes the imagination. We have to add, and this is the newer research, or this is newer research on the subject, we have to add war-related civilian casualties. And depending on how you count, you will add another 7 million civilian deaths, which puts the staggering number of World War I deaths to some 17 to 20 million. And this is not all. Civilian deaths did not end in 1918, but continued into 1922-23, and indeed, civilian deaths became the dominant feature of post-war wars. You might think of these post-war wars, well, you don't even think of them, right? What are post-war wars, right? Those among you who really are into history may know of the Russian-Polish War, Polish-Russian War. They may even think of various revolutionary events like Bela Kun in Hungary. But you have to recognize that in the Russian Civil War alone, some 8 million people died. That is almost as many as there were civilian deaths during the World War. And out of those 8 million, and that is the new sign of war in the 20th century, out of those 8 million, a mere 1 million, still a lot of people, still beyond anybody's imagination, and just statistically perhaps that can be graphed. There are 1 million military deaths and 7 million civilian deaths. That's the magnitude. You might, of course, this is a totally, oh yeah, this gives you an idea of civilian and military deaths. What you do tend to underestimate that the magnitude of civilian deaths. What are civilian deaths? Who died? Well, there are millions of displaced people who lacked shelter, who lacked food, who starved, and simply died on the road. This is a mostly Eastern European phenomenon where the war was moving rapidly, but it was also a Belgian phenomenon, and it was indeed a French phenomenon and a German phenomenon. In Germany alone, I did some work about 1918, about the city. It's not a big city. It's Halle, which is in central Germany. In 1918, in the fall of 1918, when you have a kind of new eclipse of war deaths, that this last push of the war was incredibly deadly on the front, probably the deadliest encounter of the entire war. Forget Verdun, it's 1918, where masses of people get killed. But in this city of Halle, male and female deaths were absolutely equal. How come? The women were not at the front. So who killed them? Now, try to imagine and ratchet down the millions into hundreds and then tens of people. Why would women, and especially young women, the same age cohort that the men where the men were at the front, why would young women die? Well, you have an answer? They were susceptible to disease. And why were they susceptible to disease? Because in the gender ranking in society, young women, not young mothers, but young unwed women, were the last one on the food chain. They got least to eat. They were the first to, as a result, to perish. And when then a kind of a virus came, like the Spanish influenza, it basically hit them more than any other group of people. The other group that was affected by this, a fairly big group, were people in asylums, in hospitals. Hospitals were even below the young women in terms of food supplies. They got basically nothing. And as a result, we have a first massive mass death of people in hospital, people who were incarcerated. That's what in the end amounts, if you ratchet this up and then take all of Germany, take all of Europe, take Vienna, take St. Petersburg, that even in war, where men die at the front, you have a mass death at home as well. The war was both a civilian as well as a military event. Now, returning to our theme, we are still awaiting the centenary of the main peace treaty, the Versailles Treaty with Germany in June 1919. And we still have several years to go to commemorate the other peace treaties and more generally the after effects of this war, including a vicious civil war in Russia, more or less violent state and nation-making processes in Eastern Europe. Thus, Poland just came into de facto existence in November, December 1918. This de facto existence was de jure formalized in June 1919 in the Versailles Treaty, but borders were settled only in 1922, and they were internationally recognized only in 1923. So we think, of course, of November 11, 1918 as an end of the war. But the end of the war is just one kind of war ending and another kind of war for the remaking of European society underway, among them revolutions, among them upheavals, among them nationalizing wars, like the one in which 1.3 million Greek speakers on Turkish territories were removed to Greece, and some 350,000 Muslims, including Greek-speaking Muslims, were moved from Greece to Turkey, one of the largest population movements at that time. What we find is the beginning of a new world that was quite unimaginable in the 19th century. With the still forthcoming centenary of the last peace treaty to be signed in 1923, that is the Treaty of Lausanne, we will also recall a part of the history of World War I, which until recently was on nobody's mind, but for good present and historical reasons has emerged quite centrally in our imagination. And that is the displacement of the Ottoman or Turkish Ottoman overlordship over the Near East and North Africa, the breakup, it should be said, of the oldest continuous empires on European territory, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, of course in Muslim hands since the Ottoman conquest of 1453. The replacement occurred in the sense that the British and the French established mandates, what was called in the parlance of the days, mandates over the Arab population in the Near East, and established borders and boundaries and population settlements that are exploding at this very moment in history. If we look for after effects of World War I, we will of course find the odd ammunition, and occasionally we'll find a skull or a body part somewhere in the soil of Western Europe. But here in the Near East, we find essentially the living memory of war, because what we are dealing with is the effect of the breakup of the oldest empire in the European Near Eastern hemisphere. So, if you want to think about continuities, you will want to think about Europe. But you will want to think about Europe. You might, in this context, think of the Yugoslav War of Succession in 1992, also a result, effectively, of the order created after World War I. But certainly, you would want to think of the fact that the wounds are still festering in the Near East and in North Africa, that is, Libya in particular. Now, these few snippets are in a very minimal way the question that has been set up in a very minimal way, the question that has been asked ever since. How could this mass slaughter possibly have happened? Why is it that this war, as Margaret Macmillan, one of the foremost historians on World War I, puts it so beautifully, was the war, and I quote, the war to end, not to end war, but the war to end peace. Because World War I continues, of course, first through World War II on a magnified scale, and then continues into the present as the Yugoslav or the Near Eastern situation indicates. So let me just summarize what I've discussed kind of in snippets for the moment. There are two insights involved in what I said. The first one is that historians nowadays seriously have begun to think that this world war is indeed a global war. It's not just a European war that drew in the world, which is the way we typically see things. And we have another image. Yes, this is the European war. But it is a war in which world historical events occurred well beyond the confines of Europe. What are these world historical events? Well, the stage was set in the Near East for the conflicts to come for the next 100 years that now involved, no, this is not the right thing. This is the image I want. This is the world that you got. But think of the Near East. This is here just a kind of, neutral zone, as it were. But this is where the decisions of World War I shaped the future. Beyond the Near East, almost invisible, there was a teensy minor war in which Japan and Britain, with the help of Britain, occupied this tiny little spot in China, Qingdao. But that in turn set off what Japan developed into an imperial conquest in China, and that in turn unsettled the emerging Chinese Republic and threw it into 20 years of violent civil war. So East Asia, Mesopotamia, are crucial events, are crucial world historic. World War I is a crucial world historical moment for these two regions. Add to this a third, perhaps again, looking at the Near East and Mesopotamia in particular. Who do you think fought the war against the Turks? Well, of course, the British Empire. Right? But who is the British Empire? The British Empire in Mesopotamia is the British Raj. It is Indian troops that fight the war in the Near East, and it's South African troops, and it is Australians and New Zealanders to a minor degree, but it is mostly Indian troops. Once you figure this together, Europe is still the calamity and the center, but Europe is not the globe. The globe is far more deeply involved in this, in that crucial events are set that shape the future, not just of Europe, but for the rest of the world. Second point, and again, I'm summarizing here, because I'm panicked about the time. I'm always panicked about the time. The second point is that you have seen the high civilian death tolls. Now, there is a huge debate among historians how serious we should take it and what it means. But there is no question the civilian death toll, especially in Eastern Europe and in Russia, was devastating entire populations. Which countries were most affected by World War I? Well, again, they are off the map because you think they are minor countries. It's Romania and it is Serbia, Serbia in particular, where some 30% or 40% of the population essentially vanish, are destroyed, die of hunger, die in war, die in what was one of the most outrageous military operations of World War I, when the Serbian army, together with civilians and a court and an entire society, moved across the snowy mountains down to the Mediterranean to be evacuated, where, of course, the British ships didn't arrive in time, and so there were more deaths, but eventually they were evacuated. So, what we should think of World War I, the way we should think of World War I is, of course, as a military war. I mean, as a military historian, I would want to emphasize this. These 9.7 million soldiers who died in this war and mostly died in battle are not a pittance. But World War I is also, and very profoundly, a civil war. And by civil war, I mean, to some extent, a war among factions within society, but more generally, it is a war that involves entire societies in which non-combatants, like the 19-year-old women who don't get enough food and are susceptible to disease, die, and many others die as well due to displacement and the like. So what we have is a war that digs deep into society, in which every social bond that exists is affected, in the sense that husbands die, lovers die, girlfriends die. Then you have with scarcities, you have an intensification of the struggle over food, in which women stage huge protests in Vienna, in Petersburg, and in Berlin and many other cities. You have the entire social fabric being recast. So this is a war in which entire societies are involved, in which civilians become, especially towards the end and beyond the end in the post-war wars, become major participants in the war, and in which, as a result, you begin to see in World War I, in 1918, and then in the post-war wars, 1919-20, a pattern that will define the rest of the 20th century. The rest of the 20th century is defined by a decreasing number of soldierly deaths, that is, of military deaths, and an increasing number of civilian deaths. You might not have thought of war quite this way. But in World War II, where you deal with entirely different magnitudes, you have some 70 million people being killed in one way or the other. Out of those 70 million, some 45 million are non-combatants. And this, I should say, is the future of war. In every war since 1945, there were more civilians killed than soldiers. That's the new reality of war. And I think what history can do is simply raise the awareness of this fundamental trend. And then keep in mind that in this context, ethnic groups, like the Jews, but also the Armenians, become extremely vulnerable in this context of civilian war, as it were. They become extremely vulnerable. And also notice, and you will observe this everywhere, young women are the first prey and are the most vulnerable group in any society from World War I onwards. So, this is, I think, the general message I want to bring onto the table, and that is recognize the global nature of this war. And second, recognize the all-embracing social nature of this war, in which men die at the front, but that does not mean that everything is hunky-dory at home. Quite to the contrary. This is a war that encompasses front and home. So, in the second part, I just want to very briefly, and I think I have some, want to briefly go through at 2 or 3 kind of detailed events that need to that are of interest if we want to understand World War I and if we want to understand the lessons and legacies of World War I. The first question is, of course, is the question of war guilt. Who caused this war? Well, as you know, World War I, this question has been acrimoniously debated since August 1914. The answers have ranged from making German autocratic monarchy the sole cause of World War I to the opposite, that it was not the cause at all, but everybody else. As you can imagine, that's what the Germans said in 1918, to the denial, and that is the most common answer, to the denial of anyone's war guilt. It just happened because it happened. The kind of nation slithered into the war. That was the kind of compromise solution that was offered, especially by British politicians and historians. So who would you vote, and why? Who would you vote for? Who is guilty and who is not? Well, let me first say, and this is kind of an interruption, an intermezzo, a somewhat funny intermezzo, it's still difficult to figure out how to pin guilt on any one nation. So one of the best historians on this subject is an Australian historian of Germany who teaches at Cambridge University, so impeccable credentials, Christopher Clark. He wrote one of the most learned archive-based recent books on the subject. You might have even have read. It's called The Sleepwalkers. And after going through various interpretations available, concluded that in the end, if it was not Serbia, it had all to do with a common European crisis of masculinity. So men, patriarchy, was responsible. Well, one of his neatest and one of his most hilarious, but certainly sources, but certainly to be taken seriously, and there is more of this kind, is the case of the Austro-Hungarian chief of staff, an influential advisor who relentlessly pushed for Austrian war against Serbia, even if it inflamed the entire world. Why? Well, there are enough letters to suggest that one of the reasons, maybe not the main one, but certainly one of the reasons has to do with the crisis of masculinity. Why? He could not figure out, for the earth of it, how he could possibly divorce his wife and marry his mistress. But he thought if he came back from the Serbian battlefield as a victorious field marshal, the Pope would grant him an annulment of his marriage, and he would be safe, could enter a new relationship, and everybody would be happy ever after. Now, this is actually to be taken more seriously. I'm afraid this is to be taken more seriously than you might think. Insanity and inanity is a feature in all governments, and certainly it is certainly a phenomenon that you can observe widely in 1914, and it should not be entirely discounted. Ruling elites do things for weird reasons at some times. But let's be more serious. I mean, this is the crisis of masculinity, I want to say, is not just a mistress. There is actually more to it, but it's not really where I want to settle in. It is indeed the agreement among historians, and I am fully behind this, that Germany and Austria-Hungary are the main responsible powers for starting World War I and for continuing it. But why is this? Well, there are two conditions, quite opposite, applying for Austria on the one hand and applying to Germany on the other hand, that make the reasons why Austria-Hungary and Germany go to war rather more understandable in the present than it has been for a long time. The key element was indeed, for Austria-Hungary, was indeed Serbia, the relentless nationalism of the Serbs that incited the entire Balkan in a revolution of national self-determination. Austria-Hungary, the ruling elites thought, if we don't put down Serbia, small country, but happened to be a client state of Russia, right? If we don't put down this nationalism, this kind of fundamentalist upheaval, if we don't put it down, we will not survive as an empire, as a multinational empire. Our lovely combination of Germans, Slavic speakers, Hungarian speakers, itself, it's quite tottering, but that will not survive. We will indeed collapse. And to avoid the collapse, you have to act proactively. You have to destroy Serbia in a struggle that effectively sets empire against self-determination. 1914 blows up into a global war, but the fight of the Austrians in Serbia is repeated by the struggles of the French, the wars of the French in Algeria and Indochina, the Dutch in Indonesia, and the British in Kenya. This kind of imperial war against national self-determination is a dominant theme of the 20th century. So it's Austria-Hungary, not much of a power, I think, barely memorable, just known for nice, beautiful Vienna, but effectively, this is a future that will define the rest of the century. Now, Germany is the even more puzzling and the even more puzzling case. I mean, the easy answer is to say, and this is the answer many of you would have grown up with, is to say, yes, you did have a militaristic, saber-rattling regime and a narcissistic, bombastic emperor, Wilhelm II, who was prone to verbal excess. Don't we know this? But Germany, that is important. Germany was also the country that profited from globalization more than any other country in the world. Why would Germany challenge the international order that was the source of its well-being and its wealth? Why would it cede the role as the international leader in science and technology by simply moving all its resources into war? Germany could have had it so good if it just continued what it had done all along. Outproduce everyone else, out-technologize everyone else, out-invent everyone else, at least in Europe, maybe not in the United States. And yet, they decided to go to the war. And the reason is not the Junkers, that is the aristocratic elite or this bombastic emperor, Wilhelm II. The reason has to do with globalization. And the reason might look oddly familiar to you. The reason is that globalization creates dependencies, interdependencies, that if you wish. The entire financial apparatus, this is a tribute to you, is of course British. International finance is located not in Berlin but in London. Resources are effectively transported along shipping lanes secured by the British Navy. And markets are effectively open to the challenge of protection. What if happens, these elites, the German elites, and this was not just the aristocratic elites, but also the bourgeois elites, what would happen if Britain decided that Germany got too strong, cut off the financial link, cut off the resources, or if France and Russia decided no longer to import German goods? Germany would explode. Germany, in other words, was dependent on other countries. And this was perceived as a threat to its autonomy, to its even to its existence. What was the alternative? Well, the alternative has a German word for it, which you used, and that is Lebensraum. If Germany could expand quickly enough to cover all of Eastern Europe and the Ukraine, if it could fend off France and defeat France once and for all, and thus get the Atlantic coast, effectively, then and only then Germany would be secure. The struggle here is one for autonomy, for self-preservation, for effectively trying to control everything that could produce, and that is a global thing, that could produce German wealth. So this, I think, is absolutely crucial. In an age of globalization, nations become dependent on each other. And this dependence, especially among the strong, create what I would call sovereignty panics. Ruling elites get panicked about the potential of that dependence on others and try to incorporate everything into their own realm that produces the wealth. There are other reasons for the origins of World War I, but this, I think, is the main reason that Germany deliberately set out to wage war in order to expand to a level where it could be self-sustaining and an autonomous power, resting in itself and effectively independent from everybody else. So this is my second point, but we are already in the yellow line. Are we? Do I see this? So I will possibly end not where I wanted to end, but certainly at a point that might interest you. Very briefly, and this is more a question, it is more a teaser, then I will provide an answer, but not a full answer. So why do soldiers fight? Why did they fight if they could know that with all likelihood they would be either injured, and that likelihood is great, or they would die? Why fight under these circumstances? Well, this brings me back to issues of masculinity in some way, but let me introduce one of the great daredevil acts of historiography, which is Joanna Burke's work, a young British scholar who challenged her mostly male colleagues in military history, myself included, with a first book that she entitled Dismembering the Male, Men's Bodies, Britain and the Great War, arguing that military experience of vulnerability actually led to a greater sharing of gender identities. Men had to experience in Britain, she argues, their vulnerability in order to understand that women are vulnerable. This leads to a, at least temporary, rapprochement of genders in World War I. But this was just the beginning of an illustrious career that then produced a second book, which is called An Intimate History of Killing, Face-to-Face Killing in 20th Century Warfare, focusing on British and American and Australian and Canadian experience in the two world wars. And she argues, contrary to what her male colleagues think, who all at the time thought about trauma and the deleterious effect of war on men, she argues, wrong. The license to kill in a sacred cause authorized men and vicariously women to revel in acts of killing and destruction which they would ordinarily abhor. Men find pleasure in killing, which is why they fight. She has since recanted somewhat, producing yet another book that emphasizes the role of fear. But fear as a motivating factor is rather a disabling phenomenon. It's rather an enabling and motivating factor than a disabling one. Why do soldiers fight? Well, they fight because other soldiers fight as well, and that is the orchestration that makes war possible. But why do soldiers fight? Because they put their passion and their guts into it. And that, I think, is something that we should keep in mind. Men, and nowadays women, fight because they fight with passion and they fight with dedication. They fight very rationally, it should be said, not irrationally. This is not as if the exuberance took over. Soldiers are a very calculating lot. When in 1917, French soldiers of the 5th Division thought that they were misled by their leaders, by the commanding officers, they went on strike. When Russian soldiers thought in 1917 that this war was lost and there was nothing that could salvage it, they stopped fighting. When German soldiers who fought like hell in spring 1918, the highest casualty rates through the entire war on the German, French, and British side, right? When German soldiers thought this war was lost, they thought, no more. I've done it, I've fought, I will no longer fight. They went effectively on a silent strike, moving back from the front, leaving the front exposed, or moving into becoming prisoners of war. What about trauma of the effect of war? This is my last observation. Again, you will be stunned to realize, and this is newest research, which I think is very correct. Soldiers, of course, were all traumatized. There is no question. I mean, you do not survive this war without being traumatized in one way or the other. But effectively, soldiers fought, and when the war was over, they stopped fighting, went home, talked about the war, but otherwise conducted their business, and what the trauma was between them and their wives and their family, their children, but nothing else was heard of. This notion that war necessarily creates a kind of national upheaval of trauma, that people or soldiers do not cope, is simply wrong. What's the implication of this? This is the implication I will not be able to draw out because I'm already way over. What's the implication of it? You cannot get from World War I in a simple way to World War II. The idea that the war brutalized soldiers is wrong. It traumatized soldiers, but trauma was worked through privately for the most part. So the move from World War I to World War II, when there is a connection, is not quite as easily as you might think. It's not brutalized soldiers that create the National Socialists and that create the fascist party and make it a success. If you want to look at who did it, you would have to look at civilians and of politicians who created a myth of war. And this myth of war came into being about 10 years after the fact. National Socialism in particular gained steam in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And at that point, it was a much younger generation, not the wartime generation, that was at the helm. So there is more to be said about this about the transition from World War I to World War II. But in the first instance, I have pointed to continuities, but I also want to point to discontinuities where you might expect them. World War I is very difficult, or not quite as easy as you might think, in terms of brutalized soldiers becoming free corps fighters and counter-revolutionary fighters, and then becoming the kind of stalwarts of Nazism and of the SS. This is certainly a wrong idea. What you have to bring in is an entire different set of arguments. Different set of arguments we can talk about during our discussion. They have to do with the transformation of anti-Semitism. They have to do with the discovery that indeed you can kill entire populations. You certainly can displace them. These are continuities that will make it and will become written big in World War II. Thank you.
I understand that loans were made to England by the Americans under Wilson. And the reason that the Americans came in so late they thought that Germany would win the war and they wouldn't get their money back. Another aspect to it is before the war, we had England going into Gallipoli under Churchill, and he was stopped by the Turks, and I think a lot of it was fought over black gold, oil. What do you say about that?
Both arguments have been made, and both arguments have received a mixed reception, to say the least. The first argument is the question: why did the United States enter war so late? The reason for this is not simply a fairly sizable German population that did matter in the Midwest, although it has completely disappeared as far as I can see, at least from visibility. But the more important reason was that there was a very powerful anti-war faction in the United States for various domestic reasons. This is part of a very complicated politics of the United States. It has nothing to do with a kind of deliberate withholding, because at the same time, of course, the United States started to supply the Allies with all kinds of products, from food in particular to weapons and ammunition, and by 1915 had become the dominant financier of the war on the Allied side, replacing the British. They came in 1917 effectively the way Americans enter wars, and that is with a kind of massive propaganda effort, partly supported by the British and partly instigated by the British, and there are quite interesting stories about that, by a propaganda effort that convinced, if not a majority of Americans, or we can think of it as a majority of Americans, certainly a majority of Congress, that this war would have to be fought, and it would have to be won by the United States of America. That's the part that survives that argument. Gallipoli and the war in the Ottoman Empire against the Ottoman Empire had certainly to do with oil. But oil was one component among other things, because, if we think oil, we think of the future. I mean, in World War II, very clearly oil was crucial. And the war in the Middle East was indeed a war over oil, and that was a war over replacing the British by the Americans. And it was also a war over supplying the Russians via Iran into Stalingrad, right? But in World War I, oil was an important component. And oil inside in Iraq at that point mostly was certainly an element, but it was by no means the crucial element that it now appeared. What was far more crucial at the time was to retain and secure the connection to what was the crown jewel of the British Empire, where money was made, where wealth accumulated, where British finance was clearly rested, and that is India. You do underestimate easily the importance of India, both in its direct contribution in terms of soldiers and its indirect contribution of money, that is wealth, capital, and resources, not just for the war effort, but also for the wealth and well-being of the British Empire. Without India, I think the British Empire would not be the kind of dominant hegemon it had become before 1914, and a dominance that kind of could extend into the 1920s, 30s.
Thanks so much for your talk. And my question isn't well formed, but so stick with. I'm going to try. How, as a historian, and you say we have new thinking, we look back. Our understanding evolves over time as we look retrospectively 100 years and think about how this happens. How do we think about was there somebody in real time? Was there a contemporaneous press, writer, thinker, whatever, who maybe did kind of understand what we now understand and didn't get hurt or wasn't able to have a platform or was dismissed? And how do we reconcile contemporaneous understanding of what's going on with ultimate historical understanding?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, which is actually one of the paragraphs I've skipped over. But it's nice that it comes up, and it's absolutely prescient. Why? I mean, Germans and Austrians were the main culprits. They wanted war for different reasons. But everybody else thought, and that's the British, the French, and the Russians, while this might not be the most opportune moment, and while war is not the only thing to do, we certainly are ready to fight it. Why is that? Why did everybody think they could fight? Well, the answer is that they all imagined that it would be a short war. They would be home at Christmas. Nobody thought that this war would go on for 4 years. Now, the real answer to your question is, although they thought this, although there were enough people who argued all along, and they were both among the elites, that is, in the military staffs, in finance and in industry, but also among politicians who said, no, this is going to be a long war. At the end of this, and this is a famous quotation from the German Field Marshal Moltke in the 1890s in Parliament, when he said, at the end of it, crowns will roll in the gutter. So they could have known, surprisingly, but they did not want to know, because for other reasons they thought they must fight, and if the war starts, everyone is ready to fight. So there was not, as you might expect from the British or from the French, from the Russians you can't quite expect it, although we can debate that, there was no war avoidance. That's the second aspect of the story. There is war guilt, and there is a guilt of not actually actively pursuing a course of war avoidance. If that would have been successful is another matter. But effectively everyone was ready to fight and take on the fight. And for that, in order to get there, they kind of imagined a war that simply did not happen. Now, to give you one example, just to make this a little more real, the French thought the British would instantly come in with a close blockade, because they were allied. The French and the British were allied, and a close blockade would shut down everything in Germany within absolutely no time. War would be over. The French wouldn't even have to fight, right? Would be easy for the French, right? The British fight it. But the British, of course, decided they can't fight the Germans in a close blockade. They would have to get a long-distance blockade, and this wouldn't be over in a short time. The British thought, well, the French, if egged on by the British promising a blockade, would fight. They would do the fighting, and the British wouldn't have to send more than the voluntary army it sent onto the continent. Wrong again. So you have one wrong upon other. And then you still have to wonder, and that's an entirely different kind of question, why did the war continue? I mean, okay, so you say, you discover by Christmas 1914, this is not going to be over soon. This will at least go through 1915. Why didn't they simply think this just cannot go on? You have to keep in mind the highest death rate of soldiers in the war between 1914 and 1918 was not in 1916 at Verdun and at the Somme. It was in the initial battles in 1914 and on the Eastern Front in 1915, and it was again in 1918. Why, after this huge loss of blood, why not settle down? Well, at that point, every nation came to the same conclusion. If we settle down now, we might get an agreement with the Germans, although, you couldn't have gotten an agreement with the Germans, that should be said. But you could have gotten, but even if you got an agreement with the Germans and vice versa, the Germans with the French, the people in Germany and the people in France and the people of Britain would never forgive you. You've shed so much blood that you can't stop. And so it would have, since we are here an ethical humanist society, it would have taken a principled, ethical stand that this kind of slaughter cannot go on. And only very small minorities of minorities actually took that stance. None of the politicians, none of the intellectuals, none of the elites. At least not the overwhelming majority, even came too close to thinking that this calamity must be stopped. Oh.
All right, this will be our last question.
One question for clarification. When you were discussing German rationalization because of the globalization, were you referring to World War I or World War II? I missed
World War I. World War I. I used the word Lebensraum, which you, of course, are familiar with from World War II, but the word Lebensraum is created as a new German word in the 1900s and becomes a word that is in common usage for thinking the future of Germany after 1914. So there is one of those continuities. And the bottom line is, and I think you should think about this bottom line not just in the German context, which is a historical context, in some ways my context, but also in the American context. If you want autonomy, if you really want the nation state to be everything, to produce everything within, you basically have to conquer the world in an interdependent world. You cannot shut yourself off, period. And if you try, you end up somewhere in Stalingrad, eventually in the middle of World War II, and you have plans to occupy the Caucasus and Baku in World War I. That's Ludendorff's plan. You cannot shut yourself off from the world, and you cannot control your future all on your own, unilaterally, in an interdependent world. That's essentially.
And I have a question. There was clarification in the question. I was kind of wanted to challenge you to expand your conclusion on reasoning, some of the reasoning for the cruelty and death toll in the world in wars. when you refer to cruelty of the elite, ruling elite. You know, there were some examples in history when ruling elite was replaced by those from the people, like French Revolution or Soviet Revolution, and cruelty didn't stop. They actually expanded and continued. So I wouldn't say that the monopoly.
Get at this again. So sorry.
One of your conclusions was that the ruling elite inhumanity caused so much death, and
what the effect of this is?
Right. So my challenge was, it's not only ruling elite. There are examples in history when people replace ruling elite and as inhumane as those who were in ruling elite.
Well, I think your point is well taken. Well, there are two aspects to the story. There is first, I twist your story, your question a little. There is a demographic aspect that becomes visible really only a little later, and that is in 1939 to 41. Those are kind of world historical years in terms of demographic transformation, because for the first time, the replacement rate of white European populations, wherever they are in the world, are far outrun by non-white population. The balance in demography of a dynamic demography changes in the transition from World War I to World War II. And by starting from, the demographer state is starting in 1939-40, we have a declining percentage of a white population, a rapidly rising world population that is not white. So that's the one aspect. The other aspect, if I understand you right, what are the deep shocks of this kind of these kinds of casualties? Well, the deep shocks are first and foremost personal. That is, European society is from World War I under a cloud of mourning, and this cloud of mourning hasn't lifted until the 1970s and 80s. I grew up under it, and a generation before me, my father grew under it. And this cloud is very tangible, very real. Because in every family in Europe, and that includes Russia, you have to deal with fracturing lives, fracturing relations, family members disappearing in the war, in an endless process. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that America could produce an exuberant Hollywood, the enjoyment of modernity, as it were. Europeans associate, in case of doubt, modernity always also with death and war, because that's the way modernity happened. The first modernity in the Napoleonic and the French Revolution of War, the second modernity in World War I, and the civil wars afterwards. So that kind of cloud is very intense. You have to, and that kind of cloud also produces the kind, you should keep this in mind, also produces the kind of counter movement, the kind of rage of breaking out. If you think of expressionism, the German expressionism, that kind of explosion of wanting to live at all cost and at everyone else's cost, that's a very distinctly European phenomenon. And last but not least, to come to the entire second part of what I wanted to talk to you, I can talk to you at some other time about that, is anti-Semitism changes dramatically in World War I. I had long refused the argument, but I think I'm now convinced Hitler was always a kind of ordinary anti-Semite. Everybody in Europe was an ordinary anti-Semite. But he became that vicious, annihilationist anti-Semite in World War I and in the aftermath of World War I. This was a crucial moment in the transformation towards an annihilationist anti-Semitism. That's also an aspect of the reality and the presence of war.
Thank you. We're out of time now, but Michael will stay at the coffee break.